Good morning. Thank you all for coming. We have held in this committee a number of hearings on space exploration. We've highlighted how the technologies developed benefit our lives here on Earth. We've discussed the potential dangers of near-Earth objects. We've heard about the growing commercial space industry. We've explored how NASA's efforts will eventually allow us to put an American on Mars. We even heard last year via downlink from the ISS about some of the amazing work that is going on up there. And all of that means that we have plenty of chances to share the excitement about the space program. But look, it's an empty dais, and it'll just be Senator Rubio and me when he arrives, and he's filling in for Senator Cruz, who understandably is in Texas today for the memorial service at the Army base there. So we need to generate some excitement again among the American people. And of course, things give us a problem. Now we have the tensions with Russia. Is it going to impact the space program? As we've seen before, the exploration of space has been the one area in times of geopolitical conflict that we could rise above that. And so NASA's success is not only a product of tremendous investments in technology, but also in international cooperation. And I believe that we need to continue that tradition. Geopolitics may or may not affect the nation's exploration mission. It certainly affected it back at the dawn of the space race, because the launch of Sputnik, NASA was designed in part to demonstrate to the world the power of the American way of life. NASA's 1958 Organic Act, signed by the grandfather of Susan Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, stated that U.S. space activities should contribute to international cooperation. When Secretary of Defense McNamara and NASA Administrator Jim Webb proposed a lunar mission to the Kennedy administration in 1961, they argued that, quote, our attainments in space are a major element in the international competition between the Soviet system and our own. And that's an end quote. And yet, NASA was a vehicle for working with the Soviets in the midst of the Cold War, with all of the ICBMs pointed at each other with nuclear weapons. In 1975, we had Apollo-Soyuz, the first link up between a Soviet and U.S. spacecraft, which President Nixon viewed as important in pursuing détente. General Tom Stafford, the leader of that mission, with General Alexei Leonov, they rendezvoused a Soviet spacecraft and an American spacecraft. They docked and they lived together in space for 9 days. And you talk about a role model for international cooperation. Look at the friendship today between Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov. And General Stafford testified here. He called it, quote, the shining light during the Cold War era in our relationship with the Soviet Union. That's what Tom said here. And so today, the ISS, a stunning example of engineering and cooperation, combines the contributions of 15 partner nations and the famous NASA Mars Curiosity rovers carries instruments provided by France, Canada, Germany, Russia, and Spain. So our leadership in space is a result of decades of strategic investment. If we want to maintain that position, then the investments that we're making today have got to be strategic. And yet we're in an era of limited budgets. The space arena now includes new players like China, India, and the private sector. So as we look to the future, there are a few questions that I would like to propose. What do we get out of our investment in being pioneers in space? Number two, how will each mission, such as the asteroid redirect mission, help meet our space exploration goals and benefit American interests? And Bill Gerstenmaier is going to speak to that. Number three, when and how will we cooperate with international and commercial partners, and which partners will we exclude and why? Following so many decades of advancement in space and given the high cost and amazing benefits of exploration, there's no room for rash actions, but only for very careful decision-making. Those leading exploration efforts will realize it is a truth. Those that lead will realize the economic, scientific, and political benefits. And so it's my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses. Bill Gerstenmaier, NASA Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operations. Susan Eisenhower, President of the Eisenhower Group, author of Partners in Space, which details U.S.-Soviet cooperation. She will discuss lessons learned. Dr. Leroy Chiao, Special Advisor for Human Spaceflight to the Space Foundation, former commander of the ISS, and a former member of the Augustine Commission. He will discuss the advantages and complications associated with international cooperation. Jeffrey Manber, Managing Director of NanoRacks and the author of Selling Peace, a book about work with the Russian space program. He will address the potential for commercial involvement in exploration beyond low Earth orbit. Mr. Gerstenmaier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this hearing entitled From Here to Mars. I'll briefly describe NASA's approach to human spaceflight that takes humans eventually to Mars. NASA does not see this as a monolithic mission or a classic design reference mission approach. NASA, in this constrained and uncertain budget environment, is building the infrastructure that's operations, techniques, international involvement, spacecraft, and hardware that will allow us to make sustained progress towards a human presence on the surface of Mars. NASA is developing capabilities and systems that will allow a human presence off the Earth and in the solar system. We are going off the Earth while benefiting the inhabitants of the Earth. NASA is making significant progress. Each of our activities are judged through the lens of being critical and used in future Mars-class missions. We are not building a single, one-time optimized mission to Mars, but an infrastructure that allows humans to pioneer the solar system. NASA sees three unique regions in space: Earth-reliant, where the ISS resides today; 2, the proving ground, where the asteroid redirect mission will occur in the vicinity of the Moon; and 3, Earth-independent or Mars-ready. These regions for human presence require gradually increasing risk acceptance, hardware reliability, and operational complexity. NASA believes that a stepwise approach is superior than attempting a Mars-class mission without proper preparation. Just as Mercury and Gemini prepared the way for Apollo, we see ISS in the Earth-reliant region and the asteroid redirect mission, a first mission into proving ground around the Moon, as paving the way for Mars-class missions. We also see a significant opportunity to work with the Science Mission Directorate and international partners on this approach. The International Global Exploration Roadmap, developed by 12 countries, supports this approach. The roadmap provides a framework to guide countries in their role for human exploration. NASA's current plans are implementing those first key pieces of that roadmap. The ISS plays a critical role. The ISS not only benefits life on Earth, but has a critical role in exploration and pioneering of the solar system. ISS is not only helping to understand how the human body will adapt in a long-duration spaceflight and allowing us to test high-reliability hardware such as life support for Mars-class missions, but it's allowing us to build strong international relationships and experiment with commercial private sector capabilities. It's clear that international involvement will be critical to any Mars-class mission. Jeff Manber and NanoRacks have shown the direct benefit of utilizing the commercial sector and non-government investments to augment government-sponsored activities. Mars-class missions will drive technology and will require international and commercial involvement. ISS is the first critical step in exploration. 2 other critical components are the Heavy Lift Launch Vehicle, SLS, and Orion. It's clear from all studies that a heavy lift launch vehicle is needed. When I see Russia and China beginning to talk about the need for a heavy lift launch vehicle, this reaffirms our analysis. Orion is making tremendous progress. The avionics testing in Florida completed yesterday for the test mission this fall. Orion is making tremendous progress. 80% of the software and basic avionics that will be used on the test flight this fall are the same that will be planned for future Orion flights. The test this fall also verifies heat shield performance. SLS test and manufacturing is well underway in New Orleans. Several barrel sections and domes are complete, and a vertical weld assembly is being installed in New Orleans that will allow these sections to be welded into a tank. Flight hardware for the Exploration Mission 1, an uncrewed test of SLS and Orion, is beginning to be manufactured this year in New Orleans. The European Service Module for the Exploration Mission 1 is undergoing preliminary design review in Europe. This is tremendous progress and reflects the international involvement lessons learned directly from ISS. There is real hardware in manufacture for the path to Mars. Lastly, teams are working on the asteroid redirect mission. Solid trades and analysis and requirements are in work. There are 2 concepts being investigated, one that captures an asteroid and returns it into a distant retrograde orbit around the Moon, and another that removes a boulder from a large, potentially hazardous asteroid and also moves this boulder to an orbit around the Moon. This mission leverages off of activities that were already in work: asteroid identification, solar electric propulsion, and uses the basic capabilities of SLS and Orion. The solar electric bus used for this mission will be the bus used for Mars cargo class missions. This mission allows for significant operations development in the proving ground of space near the Moon. If international partners or commercial companies have interest in a lunar surface operation, the techniques, lunar gravity assist, etc., developed by the asteroid redirect mission will enable NASA to support their efforts. The asteroid redirect mission will make significant progress towards furthering the knowledge needed for a Mars-class mission. NASA has a strong approach that extends human presence into the solar system. This approach starts with the International Space Station and the first-hand knowledge gained from the ISS in systems, human health, international and commercial partnerships. There's still a lot of work for ISS. The extension of ISS operations to at least 2024 was critical. There is also a lot of work needed to establish commercial crew capability to the ISS. The approach, ISS, SLS, Orion, and the asteroid redirect mission, coupled with commercial and international involvement, are well underway today. We have a sound approach that is sustainable, leading to eventual human presence on Mars. Human exploration and pioneering are more than a single hardware development activity, but are an integrated series of activities, all of which are required to take us from here to Mars. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Senator Rubio is going to submit his opening statement for the record, and of course, for each of you in your written testimony, it will be inserted as part of the record. Ms. Eisenhower.
Members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today. It's an honor to be here. I hope to address the geopolitical issues surrounding NASA's exploration efforts. It's impossible today to think about space exploration strategy without putting it into the context of today's events in Russia and Ukraine. I support well-targeted sanctions on Russia, which will have a direct impact on President Putin's thinking. But for reasons I will outline, I believe that rolling back space cooperation could be counterproductive and damaging to our national security and our long-term space agenda. International cooperation is vital if missions of increasing complexity are on the international agenda, such as Mars. During the Cold War, scientific and technological communities played a vital role in serving as a bridge between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then Russia, especially during times of crisis. Many multilateral and even bilateral interactions survived the Soviet invasion of Hungary, Sputnik, the U-2 incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as the Soviet invasions of Czechoslovakia and later Afghanistan. But since the Cold War ended, U.S.-Russian cooperation on nuclear security and in space has been at the heart of enhancing the United States' national security. The restrictive measures on space cooperation announced by NASA last week, however, could well threaten our achievements of the last 20 years. Here are 3 reasons why we need to lift last week's ban on all cooperation outside of the operations related to the ISS. Number 1, our national security is greatly enhanced through cooperation. Since 1992, U.S.-Russian cooperation in space has had a positive impact on the transformation of the Russian aerospace industry, which was, at the time of the Soviet Union's collapse, a bastion of Soviet hardliners. U.S. interaction with the Russians on the Shuttle Mir program and then the International Space Station brought unprecedented transparency and access to sensitive Russian facilities, along with a growing adoption in Russia of Western best practices. Since then, the lessons we've learned together have strengthened our overall performance in space beyond just the ISS and have provided an indispensable window into the workings of the Russian military-industrial establishment. Second, if the goal of limiting cooperation is designed to send a strong signal to President Putin, we need to be careful. It could well backfire. The Russian scientific community, as opposed to the Soviet aerospace industry, has traditionally been the most progressive of all sectors in that country. But today, both sectors in Russia, both the scientists and the aerospace industry, see themselves as our friends. Rather than sending a strong message to President Putin, suspension of cooperation will strengthen political hardliners who would prefer that Russia, quote unquote, go it alone or work with countries more sympathetic to their views. Number 3, safety depends on trust. Much has been said about our mutual dependency in space. Safety of human life requires cooperation. At the moment, operations on the space station are proceeding as normal. Trust, however, that invaluable yet fragile commodity can be easily eroded. NASA's announcement last week that it will suspend, quote, the majority of its ongoing engagements, including high-level visits, email exchanges, and video conferencing, could leave many of our friends in Russia high and dry and potentially change the more general atmosphere. Collective attitudes, even in the Russian space sector, could change, which might negatively impact working relationships on the ISS and potentially even safety. In conclusion, I would like to reemphasize that we know from history that it is always easier to terminate space cooperation than it is to get it started again. And we will not be able to meet our long-term goals in space without it. We should consider establishing the general principle going forward that space cooperation should be exempt from sanctions. Space has unique capacities to serve the global community. It can be a force for preventative diplomacy, transparency, and for sustaining and building bonds among those who are willing to put solely national pursuits aside. The linchpin of this goal must be engagement. We must be wary of any space policy that provides only short-term symbolic satisfaction, just as we should be cautious of those in both countries who might want to exploit this crisis for short-term commercial or political gain. They could ultimately undermine our long-term strategy in space and possibly jeopardize the enormous human and financial investment we have already made. Thank you very much. I look forward to questions.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, which policy is NASA operating under? You heard what Mrs. Eisenhower just said about the statements, and there were conflicting statements. Which is NASA operating under?
NASA, as you've seen in the press exchanges, we've exempted ISS operations from any of the sanctions or any of the issues associated with activities. And then we're reviewing kind of on a case-by-case basis the need to go ahead and continue other activities. So there's an activity, a scientific event this summer in August called COSPAR. That particular item has recently been accepted, and that event will occur. So NASA is methodically going through each one of the events and activities that are scheduled, and we're determining which ones are accepted and which ones we need to curtail.
What about the acquisition of the engine RD-180?
That's really not a NASA issue. That's between United Launch Alliance and their activities. And there's been, I'm not aware of any discussion, but that's really not a NASA issue per se.
Okay, well, we'll get into that in the Armed Services Committee. All right, Dr. Chiao.
Chairman Nelson, Senator Rubio, thank you both for your service to our nation, and thank you for the opportunity to present my views on the future of U.S. human spaceflight. The U.S. human spaceflight program drives technology development by employing our citizens to advance the state-of-the-art of several fields. Many of these technologies are adapted to purposes which improve the quality of life for people here on the Earth. These are both very good reasons to continue a robust human spaceflight program, but I believe that the biggest return on our investment is prestige and inspiration of the next generation, best put together by the mission statement of the Space Foundation, to advance space-related endeavors to inspire, enable, and propel humanity. Human spaceflight has become woven into the very fabric of our identity as a nation of explorers, innovators, and entrepreneurs. It was exactly the endeavors of Apollo and the programs prior that inspired me and my generation. We must do the same and more for our children and grandchildren, and to help maintain our position as the world leader. As you pointed out, I was a member of the 2009 Review of U.S. Human Spaceflight Plans Committee, and the current space policy is based on the major elements of one of the options that was put together. However, the main and most important message of the committee in the report was that in any case, the program needed to be robustly supported both politically and financially. Strong bipartisan leadership is needed to sustain the program across administrations. Otherwise, election cycle changes can cause confusion and waste. The committee estimated back then that the 2010 NASA budget would have been needed to increase by $3 billion, and the buying power of that sustained in follow-on years if we were going to have a credible beyond low Earth orbit exploration program. The implied message was that if we were unable to go ahead and increase the budget by that much, then the proper thing to do would have been to continue to fly space station and robustly support ISS. Unfortunately, that was not realized, and NASA has been directed to attempt to put together a credible beyond low Earth orbit program within the framework of basically essentially a flat budget in terms of buying power. The challenge of this cannot be overstated. This is why you've seen a lot of conflicting proposals and different changes over the last several years, settling now on the asteroid redirect mission. But the first crew to fly to that asteroid is currently being planned for 2021, which is still some years away. And that assumes that the SLS is developed on time with no hiccups and no further reduction in budget. Thus, the first step, I believe, to go from here to Mars is to ensure that the budget is sufficient to support the program. The realistic sustainable funding level for beyond low Earth orbit, maybe it should be determined a priori and then the program scoped accordingly. If we cannot adequately support both politically and financially the low Earth orbit, beyond low Earth orbit program, then we should not attempt it. The ISS is the current low Earth orbit human spaceflight program. It serves not only as a common point for the international partner community, but is a critical part of the development of the Beyond Low Earth Orbit program itself. The most challenging aspect about flying beyond low Earth orbit is the technical challenge is not a matter of computers or navigation or propulsion, but rather how do we keep astronauts healthy that far away from the Earth for that long of a duration of flights. The ISS is critical to the development of operational medical countermeasures to ensure that we can keep our astronauts healthy as we contemplate these more demanding flights. The National Space Biomedical Research Institute, or NSBRI, was formed about 17 years ago by NASA at the recommendation of the National Academies. The NSBRI has built a consortium of the finest biomedical research universities and institutes across the country, and it is targeting applied research to develop countermeasures to enable these beyond low Earth orbit flights. This work maps to and adds unique value to NASA's human research program. The ISS is currently scheduled for decommissioning in 2024, although studies have shown that it can be safely operated through at least 2028 and perhaps beyond. I believe that life should be extended to as long as practical so that we can go ahead and make sure that we are able to develop these countermeasures. Similarly, the NSBRI will reach its 20-year life contract in 2017, and I believe it also should be renewed to ensure no loss of continuity in these countermeasure developments. Commercial flights to low Earth orbit is a logical evolution. It was perhaps the most exciting yet the most controversial part of the new space policy, but I think the commercial companies have made impressive strides. Already we have companies delivering cargo commercially to the ISS, and we have companies working with NASA's support on developing the capability to launch astronauts to the International Space Station. In contrast to what some people think, these commercial efforts are not in competition with the NASA's Beyond Low Earth Orbit program. They're complementary in that these commercial flights support the ISS, which supports the Beyond Low Earth Orbit program. A sustainable Beyond Low Earth Orbit program requires a heavy lift launcher, so the SLS is something that would be essential, either the SLS or something like it, for our long-term goals in Beyond Low Earth Orbit space. However, the current budget does not support a reasonable plan, timeline, or complement of missions. As I mentioned before, the first flight with a crew on board is only planned for 2021. That, again, assumes that everything goes perfectly. It is important during the buildup of a flight test program, or to have a buildup of a flight test program for a new development with meaningful and consistent flight rate during the development of something like a Beyond LEO program. This is so you can develop the ground and flight operations and maintain team proficiency. If the national budget cannot be increased to support such a plan for SLS Orion, perhaps we need to start thinking about some other possibilities. If we think of SLS Orion as Apollo Saturn flights, maybe we need to take a look at possibly having something analogous to the Gemini program. The Orion is being currently built, and the first flight, as you heard, is scheduled for later this year using an existing launch vehicle and upper stage. A similar configuration possibly could be human-rated and be used in a series of meaningful test and development missions. Such a build-up flight test program using this configuration could be planned to thoroughly test Orion systems, develop rendezvous and docking operations, and include first destinations beyond low Earth orbit. The latter flights will be used to characterize the flight environment beyond Earth's magnetosphere, to develop operations, and to characterize other issues as well, and test biomedical countermeasures. These flights would pave the way for the more ambitious SLS Orion missions. SLS will enable robust Beyond LEO missions, which should include the development of a crew-tended base on the Moon. This base would be used as a test bed for hardware and operations developed for eventual human spaceflight flights to the surface of Mars. While it would be technically possible to bypass the Moon on the way to Mars, I believe it would be imprudent and would add risk. The importance of thorough ground and build-up flight tests to ensure program success is clear has been demonstrated many times and cannot be overstated. One of the principal findings of the 2009 committee was that the U.S. can lead a bold, new international effort in the human exploration of space. Having common, very visible civil space projects leads to better relationship between partner countries and provides the potential for overall cost savings. The ISS is a great example of such a program, and future human spaceflight programs should expand on this model. Currently, for the last 3 years, the only entities able to launch humans into space are Russia and China. Thus, China is an obvious addition to the International Human Spaceflight Partnership, both for the ISS program and beyond. China has successfully demonstrated rendezvous and docking capabilities, extravehicular activity, and operation of a crew-tended LEO space module. The Chinese have a long-term plan that includes construction of a space station in 2018 with full operational capability by 2022. China is in a unique position to be a unique partner, and the people who are concerned about security and technology transfer concerns, I would say that we can handle those things the same way we have with the Russians. To my knowledge, there have been no improper transfers in either direction. America can and should be the clear world leader of international space exploration, both in LEO and beyond. What is needed is consistent and sustained, strong political and financial commitments from the White House and the Congress. NASA requires the resources to create a robust, integrated international exploration plan that will lead us into the next exciting phase of human spaceflight. Thank you.
Dr. Chiao, you're not suggesting that the asteroid redirect would preclude the lunar mission?
No, sir, not at all. In fact, there is much to be learned from an asteroid redirect mission. And to avoid any confusion, I just want to make clear that my statements about another program or sub-program would be complementary to the SLS and the Orion.
And that was the program that you testified where there would be a program on the surface of the moon?
Well, the moon would be part of the SLS Orion. It would be follow-on to the asteroid redirect mission.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. Mr. Manber.
Thank you, Chairman Nelson, Senator Rubio. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of NanoRacks, a private firm which has developed a strong customer base on board the International Space Station. Let me start by saying that NanoRacks' business model would be commonplace in any industry other than human spaceflight. We build our own research facilities with our own money. We market these facilities and our services to customers at set prices. We began the company 4 years ago without a NASA contract. Instead, we negotiated access to the real estate on board the station and access to the NASA launch manifest. Critical has been NASA's willingness to let us attempt a new way of adding services and facilities to the ISS. I applaud Mr. Gerstenmaier and the Space Station Program Office, led by Mike Sefardini, for allowing a private company to attempt this new role. At NanoRacks, we are very much aware that we may lose our money. We may fail in the marketplace to continue attracting customers. Our equipment may not always work. But these risks are not borne by the taxpayer. They're borne by our investors. That is how business works in the real world, and it's how it should also work in outer space. How are we doing? NanoRacks has flown 150 payloads to date. We have 100 more in the pipeline, and we are averaging just 9 months through the NASA safety process, a tiny fraction of the usual timeline. Today, I can tell you that every single day, NanoRacks is showing that more and more consumers, teachers, researchers, companies around the world see a value in paying for station utilization and including station in their plans. For us, for our customers, for the space station, and for the intent of you in Congress, the payoff has been dramatic. We estimate that today there is close to $150 million in private capital from venture capital firms and personal investors now supporting NanoRacks and our customers. The resulting economic valuation is estimated to be much higher, with significant job creation in California, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. The global recognition of the power of American-style open markets is perhaps the single most enduring result of the end of the Cold War, whether in former communist nations, now in low Earth orbit, and yes, I am sure, one day on the Moon and Mars. Because of the success of companies like NanoRacks contributing to the International Space Station, I believe the viability of market economics in outer space is finally coming of age. NanoRacks' experience is showing there is little difference between a government organization here or abroad and a non-government institution in terms of customers. To us, they are all customers. Our transactions are fundamentally commercial in nature. Our customer list today includes the German Space Agency DLR, Romanian Space Agency, parts of ESA, and companies and organizations from Israel, Japan, UK, Lithuania, Vietnam, and Saudi Arabia. In short, commercial space has become a new form of international cooperation, and I'm really grateful for everyone in the NASA International Office who's allowed NanoRacks to begin to play this commercial role. NanoRacks has already shown that the divisions and tensions that have sometimes characterized the government versus commercial debate in our industry are becoming, in our view, outdated. For too long, we have considered space exploration as an either-or proposition. Either the program is government-driven, government-operated, and government-funded, or it must be commercial. NanoRacks is showing on Space Station that such distinctions are unreasonable and even unproductive. The government can therefore play many different roles in human exploration. It can be a facilitator, a landlord, and almost always a customer. Depending on where we are going, the private role could be smaller or greater. Whether we're reaching for Mars or returning humans to the moon or exploring asteroids, a flexible partnership is where and how we should be heading. Turning to near-term beyond Earth orbit exploration, we are committed to using ISS as a launch pad for this new chapter in human spaceflight. We understand NASA is focused on Mars. At NanoRacks, we too may have Mars in our hearts, but we have lunar in our business plans. We can see well replicating ISS's new commercial environment with a lunar program, off-the-shelf hardware, commercial economic efficiencies, low cost enough for student participation, market leadership in both technology and market savvy. Sure, we can do Mars, but that's going to take a little more doing and understanding the commercial relationships. Congress has stayed the course on the International Space Station. Thank you for that. Your reward, our reward, is a stable beachhead in space, both technically and now commercially. I mentioned about our new relationship with NASA. Yes, NASA is our landlord and safety official, but the space agency is every day less and less of a competitor, leaving to the private sector those services that we do best. Thank you.
Mr. Manber, you remember it was not too long ago that the space station was supposed to cease to exist in 2015.
Yes, indeed.
And that was extended to 2020. Now, fortunately, the president's budget has recommended that it be extended to 2024. I mean, from this senator's standpoint, that's the least we could do. Seems to me it ought to go to the end of the decade. $100 billion investment with all the things that you have just testified clearly is worth continuing. Mr. Gerstenmaier, sequester is part of the budget for the next 8 years, unless we can change it. And there are some of us in bipartisan discussions right now that are trying to change that. But limited funding is a reality over the course of the next several years. So would you make the case for the record of why the asteroid redirect mission is doable, number one. Number two, does not preclude a lunar mission. And number three, develops the technologies and procedures that ultimately get us to the goal of Mars in the decade of the 2030s. Senator Rubio, my question was for Mr. Gerstenmaier to make the case with limited funding, which is a reality over the course of the next several years, for Mr. Gerstenmaier, who's the best of the best in NASA, to make the case of why the asteroid redirect mission, number one, develops the procedures and the technologies ultimately going out to the goal in the 2030s of Mars. And number two, does not preclude a lunar mission. As many people have spoken, it's like it's either or. And doing that within the context of limited budgets. Go ahead, Mr. Gerstenmaier.
Again, if I try to go back to a little with what's in my testimony, the way I would describe it is, if we looked at any other real activity, it's going to require a significant amount of new investment on NASA's part. So if we tried to go to an asteroid in some distant location away from the moon, we need to build some kind of habitation module to augment Orion. We need to do significant medical research to keep our crews healthy during that period of time frame. We have to do significant life support development. So that's a lot of new development to go do an activity there. It's been talked about, Mars flyby missions, the same kind of thing. If you look at the amount of investment that needs to occur to make that a reasonable mission, to keep the risk down to appropriate levels, a tremendous amount of investment. So the asteroid redirect mission, it moves essentially a piece of the solar system to a location around the moon, which we can get to with Orion and SLS the way they're being designed today. So the first test flight of Orion EM2 scheduled in fiscal year 2021 to 22. That mission with crew can go to the moon in that vicinity with really no changes. The asteroid redirect mission doesn't require any changes to the Orion capsule. Basically, we can do the spacewalk from the Orion capsule the way it's designed. So there's no unique hardware needed in that aspect. It also puts us in the vicinity of the moon, which we think is a great proving ground to go understand how to operate in space. We'll now be 5 days away from an immediate return back to the Earth on station. We can get back in a couple hours, but in the moon environment, we're going to be roughly 5 days away. We'll use lunar gravity assist, which will be an important technique to learn how to operate for missions to Mars and other locations. Also being in the vicinity of the moon and lunar orbit, it enables, if our partners want to do something on the surface of the moon or commercial activities want to do things on the moon, we can assist them in those activities with Orion. So it effectively uses exactly what's there for SLS and Orion. It also took advantage of what the Science Mission Director was already doing. They already had an asteroid observation campaign, so we did not have to build a unique asteroid observation campaign. We leveraged off of what they were doing already. The Science Technology Mission Directorate, it was building a solar electric bus to be demonstrated to look at electric propulsion, which will be needed for Mars-class missions. We'll leverage off of their work that they're doing, and it uses SLS and Orion. So it essentially used all the pieces we had put together. It allows us to make significant and real progress towards gaining the capabilities to go to Mars, and it also enables the moon. So when you put all those together for the modest investment, I think it makes sense moving forward. And lastly, the bus that we use to actually go capture this asteroid and redirect it around the moon, that same electric bus would be used for cargo missions to Mars. So that is extensible going forward. So when I look at the options in front of us, I look at the budget environment that you've described, the uncertainty, this is the way that we can make significant progress moving forward that keeps us focused towards Mars, but doesn't preclude the moon, but yet keeps us moving in a positive direction and helps us work with our international partners and stay a leader in space.
Just to close this out, and it is affordable within that time frame over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, of which, if we went directly on a mission to go back to the moon's surface, you're talking about a lot more money. Is that correct?
Yeah, the difference would be to go back to the surface of the moon with a human-class mission, we would have to build a human lander to go to the moon. We don't see that as necessary for Mars. To enter into the Martian atmosphere with its atmosphere is much more difficult. To do entry, descent, and landing into Mars requires new technology development. We think that's where our focus ought to be for the next big lander. We ought to be looking at how we land a crew-sized capability on Mars and not go back and replicate to some extent what we've already done on the moon for moon landing. But now if a commercial company would like to do that or an international partner would like to do that, we will be capable with Orion to be in cislunar space, and we can assist them with those activities. So we don't preclude that activity. But in this limited investment, we want to invest in the technologies that have not been done and the things that will help us and keep us a leader and keep us moving forward towards ultimately Mars-class missions.
But you said, but we don't preclude that activity. So if the geopolitics suddenly changed that it was important to the United States to get back to the surface of the moon before, say, the Chinese would with humans, if that were the case, we'd already have a lot of the technologies developed and we'd be sitting out there close to the moon already. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I would say that if you look today, there's countries talk about building Orion-class capsule that could go to the vicinity of the moon. There is no country doing that really today other than us. And this vehicle, you can go down to Florida and you can see today that's getting ready for the test flight this fall. That is the basic capsule shape. That is mostly the avionics that will fly. It's mostly the software that's there. So we are, again, being a leader, and we are building a capsule that allows us to take humans beyond low Earth orbit to the vicinity of the moon. The SLS is also another rocket that other countries talk about. They've conceptualized that. They're not putting hardware together. You can go to New Orleans and you can actually see barrel sections of the oxygen and hydrogen tanks actually manufactured as test articles. You can see this large welding equipment, the largest in the world, that will use state-of-the-art reaction friction stir weld to assemble tanks. We're moving forward. We're at the Marshall Space Flight Center today doing acoustic tests of scale model rockets firing solid rocket motors next to the model to go look at launch activities. Down in Florida, we're modifying Pad 39B to accommodate the new launcher capability. So this country, again, is leading, and we are making real investments in real hardware that you can go out, see, visit, touch, and they all fit in this ability to get humans beyond low Earth orbit, which other countries talk about, but we are still the leader in doing that, and our activities will enable and we'll be able to cooperate with them in their activities as they move forward. And the Global Exploration Roadmap shows their desires, what they would like to go do. It also shows where we fit, and then this allows each country to kind of decide for themselves what their role is in human spaceflight and how they want to fit and build hardware. But we are the leader with the SLS and Orion that we're building today.
As I turn to Senator Rubio, would you describe one of the activities of a rover on the surface that could be controlled from Orion, with Orion being in cislunar space?
We see the ability of getting into the vicinity around the moon, either at a Lagrangian point, which is a gravity location around the moon, or in a distant retrograde orbit. We can use crew members in Orion to actually command a robotic spacecraft on this, or a robotic rover on the surface of the moon and do activities. There's a lot of interest on the far side of the moon. There's some discussion that's occurred about putting a radio telescope on the far side of the moon where it's shielded from the radio interference from the Earth. You could actually deploy that antenna on the far side of the moon from an orbiting spacecraft from Orion orbiting the moon, and actually do those kind of operations on the surface of the moon. And we did a demonstration of that from Space Station. We actually used Space Station to drive a rover in California that deployed essentially a plastic antenna on a simulated lunar field in California to go actually see if we could go do that. So when we get to this vicinity of the moon, we can do robotic activities on the surface of the moon from Orion as a temporary spacecraft in a roughly a 5 to 6 day orbit around the moon.
Thank you very much. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing, and all of you for being here. Let me just start by segueing from that last question that was asked. To be clear, all of the things that as we talk about this long-term goal of landing in Mars in 2030, I think what you're describing is that all the things we're doing now in the interim all build upon each other. In essence, we're creating capability along the way. These are not separate programs, though they have separate aims and segues. The general path is, as is with all space exploration, is that previous missions create technological platforms upon which we can build in the future. They're all moving ultimately in the same direction. So we're not really duplicating efforts here. We're kind of constructing one on top of the other. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think that's accurate. I think the other thing we need to take advantage of with this group here is that there's also a significant advantage we can get from international partners in this activity, and also from the commercial sector. So we need to change our thinking a little bit, where it used to be only a government program, and look at creative ways we can use the commercial sector and use the international community to augment what we are doing.
Well, that's what I wanted to segue to. And I've already cleared this with the Chairman, I wanted to submit a statement for the record by Mr. Dean Cheng, who's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, who's an expert in our relations with China regarding space matters. He's unable to participate in today's hearing, but has submitted his testimony, and he brings forward some interesting perspectives on the issues we'll discuss today. Let me begin with Mr. Chiao. You mentioned at the close of your statement about cooperation with China. Let me back up for a second and make this statement. We Americans have always viewed the space program, certainly over the last 30 years, as a sort of cooperative effort that certainly helps our country but benefits all mankind. We have viewed it as a peaceful endeavor, as one that can unite people, and we've seen the fruits of it. But I think that we have to be cautious that an understanding that not every other nation has the same view. And I think China in particular potentially poses a pretty interesting dilemma for us. Certainly their space program, ours is largely, there's certainly military components to our program, but our space program is largely driven by civilians and has civilian methodology and civilian purposes behind it. Everything in China, but certainly the space program, is deeply linked with the PLA, and we've seen evidence of that. So I would just want to further expand on your statement. I don't necessarily disagree. I think in an ideal world we'd want cooperation with China, because I think three major powers, Russia, China, the United States, and others, working in conjunction, if in fact we all had the same goals, could certainly get some of these things accomplished quicker than any nation on its own. But I also think we have to be careful and realistic that we not somehow ascribe our motivations and our way of thinking to that of another nation that perhaps has different aims and goals for their space program. And I think that and one of the things highlighted in Mr. Cheng's written testimony is warnings about that, about the threat of potentially seeing China use sensitive information to improve its ballistic missile capability and so forth, but also its desire to, quite frankly, achieve what they have termed in their own documents, what they've called publicly space dominance, which is not our view. Our view is not, the U.S. doesn't, we may necessarily want to be the most predominant space power in the world, but we don't view it as a dominance thing. We view it as something that great nations do great things. So here's my question. In your experience, and certainly because you mentioned it in your statement, do you see any potential pitfalls in terms of the Chinese attitude towards the space program that, in essence, places them in an incompatible position to our own view of what space should be about?
Well, as you mentioned, and it's certainly true that the Chinese space program is part of the PLA. Now, operationally wise, and that's kind of the way I think, you know, I understand the distinction, but functionally it shouldn't make that big of a difference, because we're going to be working on civil space together, and they have a clearly delineated civil space part of their organization. So I don't see any roadblocks, if you were, or stumbling blocks. And as far as sensitive information is concerned, we have the safeguards that we can put in place to make sure that there are no improper technology transfers. And you know, frankly, from a you know, guidance system, ballistic missile, those aren't things that we work on at NASA. We don't develop the guidance systems. We certainly don't transfer it to our partners. Information like that. So it can be controlled, and as far as I know, it's been very successfully controlled with our relationship with the Russians.
And again, I mean, that's the ideal scenario, is that we would be able to work with them cooperatively. I'm just always concerned that somehow we ascribe to other countries the same motivations as what we have for the space program, and sometimes that those things don't add up, and I just want to make sure we're cautious about it. But I think we all share your goal if it's achievable, which I pivot now to Ms. Eisenhower. Your testimony was about Russia, and I think you raised some interesting points in your testimony about things like, for example, Russian scientists associated with the space program are among the most progressive elements in their society. We've enjoyed a depoliticized relationship with them. There's safety concerns about cutting off interaction with them. And then there's also the geopolitical realities of what's in the headlines today. And I just want to hear maybe you expand a little bit more about how we balance those two things, because on the one hand, there are geopolitical realities. I think when Americans see what's happening in Ukraine, we're uncomfortable about the fact that we're paying, was it $70 million a seat? Is that right? Does that sound right?
$70 million, sorry.
To get a seat on those flights to the Russians, and we depend upon them now for being able to launch our astronauts into space. So you can understand the political implications of that domestically, and on the other hand, you've raised some interesting points about we don't want to cut off the scientific community in Russia that, quite frankly, has been either apolitical or in many instances progressive in their thought process in terms of our ongoing relationship. And it seems to be a relationship that has some significant degree of cooperation that's been able to overcome whatever is happening politically elsewhere in the world. So perhaps you could describe that a little bit better for us in terms of what that actually looks like, and maybe a roadmap moving forward. How do we navigate this, for lack of a better term, minefield that we find ourselves in?
Well, thank you very much, Senator Rubio, and it's an honor to be able to be here and to share my thoughts on this. I think this requires, this particular situation requires a really very nuanced strategy, which of course is extremely difficult in today's world where everything is given a bumper sticker, and but nevertheless, I think a nuanced approach is important for the simple reason that we want to make sure that we express our displeasure with Russian behavior, and we do so in a way that's going to count with the regime, and not to punish our friends who, you know, I think it would also, everybody here would back me up by saying that the Russian space program is much more important, or space in general is much more important in Russia than it is in this country. If this were a Duma committee, you would have a full room. And so, yes, it has a very big symbolic impact, but we have made extraordinary strides in the last 20 years in bringing what was a very, very hardline aerospace community into a fully cooperative relationship, as we've seen over the last years. If I were in charge, I would be organizing sanctions to hit exactly at the heart of the regime itself, the people that interact most directly with Vladimir Putin and others. If the scientific community had that kind of influence with Vladimir Putin, they would not have lost their recent political struggle over the future of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So that I do think that is the political reality on the ground. And then the other point I would make is that none of this interaction, maybe this will actually have some reference to Dr. Chiao's comments too about China. I think we engaged the Russian Federation after the collapse of the Soviet Union not to do them a favor, but to do us a favor. We gained unprecedented access to some of their most sensitive facilities. And I think if you look at the China situation, we could well gain every bit as much as they might in terms of understanding how our two societies view this area, this important area, and also to give us that kind of access in China. Bill Gerstenmaier played a leadership role in negotiating the agreements with the Russians at that time. By the way, I have supplied a copy of Partners in Space for both of your committees. But in any case, I think this is really about enhancing our national security, and we want to make sure that we don't jeopardize our national security and lose access to those important communities while we're legitimately trying to express our displeasure to the Russian government.
And then my last question, I'm going to go back to you, Mr. Gerstenmaier, because I think you, in your written testimony, but this is open to any of you that want to answer this, because I think this is a more big picture, broader question. In your statement, you talked about, this is a quote, to channel all of the factors that have enabled our space achievements to date in a way that will ensure a sustainable foundation on which future generations can continue to build, unquote. And I mean, the key part for me of that statement is future generations. And the notion that we, the scientists and engineers, many of the people who will work on a 2030 mission, for example, to Mars, are probably in college right now or thinking about what they're going to major in college. And maybe I'm wrong, but my sense is that at a broader public level, we have lost some of the public awareness and or enthusiasm of what the space program means for the country, and some ideas from you, I guess, from all of you, as to how we can reinvigorate that. I think if you go back to 1960, when President Kennedy made that promise that we would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade, that invigorated the American scientific community to pursue with the singularity of mind that in addition to getting a man on the moon and back safely, also, by the way, had all sorts of commercial and technological advances that were made that benefited our economy and society as a whole. How can we reinvigorate a new generation of people to pursue or go into these fields that are so critical? And more importantly, this comes at a time when we have so many young people looking for what fields they can go into that will provide stable middle and higher income jobs that have opportunities in the 21st century. I guess my question is, from a public relations standpoint, what can we do more of to excite people about what space can mean for the future and get more people interested in the fields that are the backbone of any successful endeavor?
It's a really difficult question. You know, my experience has been when I expose folks to what we're doing, and by folks I think of high school kids and maybe even grade school kids, they really get excited about what we're doing. And sometimes when I'm kind of down in the mouth and I'm worried about sequester and budgets and I look at all the wonderful things we could do if we just had more budget, I forget what we're really doing with what budget we have. And when I go expose some of the younger students and some of the other folks to what we're doing, that excitement comes back, and then I get re-energized again, and then I'm ready to go back. So one thing is, I think we need to talk to them unashamedly about what we're doing and capture some of the excitement. If you think about what we're doing with this asteroid redirect mission, we're going to grab a piece of the solar system, we're going to deflect it around the Earth, deflect it around the Moon, and insert it into a distant retrograde orbit around the Moon where our crews can go visit with the Orion capsule. You know, that seems kind of boring to some folks when I say all that, but if you talk to some kids that are still excited and they think about what we're really doing, that is really a big deal. I mean, to think we are moving a piece of the solar system for our use that will allow us to learn skills and techniques that we need to push human presence into the solar system, that's a pretty awe-inspiring statement. But I think we get so jaded because we talk about, well, why don't we go to the Moon, or let's go to the Mars, or let's do some other activity. We have kind of, you know, it's buyer's neglect, right? It's when you order your food in the cafeteria and you look over and you see what somebody else ordered, and immediately what's in front of you isn't appetizing enough. You wish you would have ordered what that person next to you did. I think we have to ignore that a little bit and look at what we've got in front of us, look what this country can do, and not be ashamed about what we're doing moving forward.
And by the way, I agree. If more people, I don't have a public polling on this, but I would venture to guess that an extraordinary majority of Americans are unaware of the existence of that program. Certainly, the majority of our young students and even in college are. And I think we could rally people around a goal like that. But I think maybe it's incumbent upon us in public office who hold these positions and have these forums to make people aware of what we are actually working on, what's there, what's tangible. I think people would be very excited about thinking that they could be a part of an effort like that, or, you know, the subsequent efforts that will lead off from that. But I just think a lot of people don't even know we're doing that.
Yeah, if I could just add a few comments. I think the key to stoking public interest is flying more and flying sooner. And that's why, in part of my remarks, I talked about the need for possibly a new sub-program of earlier flights that will get us beyond low Earth orbit more quickly. Now, as I mentioned also, we do need for a sustainable program, we do need a heavy lifter like SLS and Orion. And as Mr. Gerstenmaier said in his remarks, I think it's absolutely possible that we could do these kinds of missions in partnership with commercial and with international, and thus do it maybe without a big increase in the NASA budget. So I'm hopeful that somewhere in the near to midterm, we can be flying more often and doing missions that will develop the capabilities to go back to the Moon one day and then on to Mars. And this could be done in partnership context that might be very creative and synergistic. And I think that's the way that we get the public interested in spaceflight.
That is correct. Once you start putting Americans on American rockets, the interest in this country is going to accelerate. How many people have come up to me and said, "Did you see the movie Gravity?" They were really gripped by it. Well, they'll be gripped when you see an American climbing in and strapping into an American rocket. And that's the good news. The bad news is that it's going to be 2017 in a commercial rocket getting to the space station, unless you believe some of the commercial companies that it can be 2016. And then Orion, it's not going to be until 2021. But these things are complicated. And so that excitement will return, but we've got to keep pressing on. We have a vote that is called right now. I'm going to recess and quickly run over and vote and come right back. It's not a series of votes. It should be just one vote. And then we'll continue with the questions. Thank you so much. The committee will stand in recess. The committee will resume. I want to ask a quick question to a couple of you about the Commercial Crew Program. Mr. Gerstenmaier, would additional funding allow us to speed up the start of domestic flights to the ISS?
Again, I think probably the most critical thing right now is to get the funding that we've requested in the President's budget in 2015. We have a pretty solid plan. Our goal is to select a commercial provider in the August-September timeframe of this year, but to make that happen and to be there by the end of 2017, as we've talked about, I really think we absolutely need the funding level that the President has requested. 15 is probably one of the more critical years in terms of where we are in development and activities. This is really the paramount year of when we need funding for commercial crews. So any support we can get to the President's budget for that activity is absolutely what we need.
So the answer to that question is yes, because the President had requested about $850 million for commercial crew. And over the years, it had gone from $300 million to $500 million to develop commercial crew, start the competition, et cetera, then to about $700 million. And now for fiscal year 15, which starts October the 1st, it's about $850 million. I agree with you, and so the answer is yes. All right, Dr. Chiao, how does commercial access to low Earth orbit support further exploration?
Well, thank you for the question, Senator. Commercial crew will ensure access for Americans to the International Space Station, and as you know, the ISS is designed to be operated internationally. That is, we need the crews on the ground and in the station working together in conjunction in order to effectively operate the space station. The space station is critical for developing the international or the biomedical countermeasures that we need to develop and test before we can send crews beyond low Earth orbit for any significant period of time. The station also, of course, serves as a test bed for technology, all the new things that we're going to be developing and proving out before we can start sending crewed missions farther from the Earth for longer durations. And so in that way, commercial crew very directly supports the station, which directly supports the Beyond Low Earth Orbit program.
Ms. Eisenhower, what lessons might we take away from the lapse of what you mentioned in your testimony of the need for engagement even during diplomatic uncertainty? The Space Cooperation Agreement between the U.S. And the then Soviet Union lapsed in the years following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So given from that lapse, what was the key to managing the relationship through the many crises of the Cold War?
Oh, sorry. Yes, well, that lapse between Apollo-Soyuz in 1992 when the shuttle Manber program began, I think the biggest impact is that a generation of people were lost who actually knew how to engage in this kind of cooperation. Even though Apollo-Soyuz was not a huge program, there just wasn't the interactive culture that we see today. And one reason I'm concerned about space being involved in some of the measures we may take in response to the current crisis is that it would be very sad to see anyone disengage in this process, because long-term space is going to require the Russians, long-term. So I think that gap does have a workforce implications. As I said in my testimony, too, the Eisenhower administration, which was the administration in power during the dawn of the space age, but also at a crucial stage at the early part of the dawn of the nuclear age. The administration's greatest concern was the development of what might be called paranoid uncertainty. and saw these kinds of programs. That would be the Atoms for Peace conferences, and later work around the International Geophysical Year as being stabilizing precisely because of those crises. It's remarkable that after Sputnik, actually, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in private negotiations over the future of Antarctica. And it was as a result of the International Geophysical Year and the fact that that cooperation had not been suspended that we managed to demilitarize an entire world continent, which is the Antarctic, which is today, a real testbed and laboratory for the scientific community. So I think, I know that as NASA understandably goes through reviewing all of its programs, that it not underestimate the importance of these conferences, because the conferences, in fact, at least in the past, played a very significant role. Thank you, sir.
Would you think that that kind of collaboration that you're talking about, would that ultimately apply to our relationship with others up-and-coming spacefaring nations, such as China and India?
Well, I must say that since cooperation with Russia in the last, since 1992 has been so successful, I really do think that it makes a lot of sense to be able to look at engaging other countries more deeply. As I said earlier, we didn't do it for them, we did it for us. We not only had an opportunity to create more transparency, but actually in the book Partners in Space, which I've left a copy for you, we learned a lot from the Russians too. They had some very, very elegant ways of handling complex situations on a very tight budget, which actually could be quite a useful discipline these days. I'm sure the Chinese have very interesting and creative ways of looking at solving exactly the same kind of problems in space. And that's why I alluded to the fact that we, in fact, have a much more robust effort in space today, because we did share ideas about how to solve some of these common problems. And what came together, actually, at the end was something that was really not like the way it was for anybody before, because we put different scientific and technological perspectives together to create something very robust and strong.
I must admit that I am shaped in part by my past experiences. For example, in the 1980s, out of an administration policy in the 80s, they started allowing American satellites to be launched on Chinese Long March rockets. And basically, there was supposed to be a firewall there so that they couldn't get our technology, and of course they got it. It's many years later, and we're confronted with a different situation, but I personally think that the United States was taken advantage of by the Chinese, by some well-meaning folks in the administration at the time. They were so well-meaning, in my judgment, they were naive. But it is what it is, and here we are in the year 2014. What do you think, Dr. Chiao, about the international collaboration? And do you think we can best engage now with these up-and-coming spacefaring nations?
Well, Senator, I have to admit, in the early 90s, I grew up during the Cold War, and so during the early 90s, I was one of the skeptics of working with the Russians, and I was wondering why we were doing this. But after I went over there and started working with these folks and started seeing the advantages of the big picture of international relations and bettering things not only between, cooperating in space, but just between our two countries, I became a big believer in international collaboration. And so I think there are always going to be risks. I mean, first of all, it's clear to everyone, I think, that the Russians are trying to spy on us. The Chinese are trying to spy on us. We're spying on everyone. Everyone's spying on everyone else. So there's going to be attempts to get technology from all sides. And I think the safeguards that we have in place, that we put in place with the Russians, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not aware of a single instance where there's been an inappropriate transfer of technology. Now, to your point about the Chinese missile technology being benefited from some American advice, unfortunately, that was due to naivete at the time, I think. It was not anything directly to do with launching satellites on their vehicles, except that in the post-accident investigation, some American experts naively gave them some advice which probably helped improve their rockets. That's something we've learned from, I think, and we can, and as I mentioned, the safeguards, that can be part of the safeguards that I think will make the benefits of cooperating more outweigh the risks of possibly losing some technology. As Ms. Eisenhower mentioned, we can gain great insights into the Chinese program. I've been over and seen their technology. I've seen their rocket factories and their space center, their control center, and it's impressive. They're doing some really impressive things, and I think we would gain a lot of insight into what they're doing in this relationship if it were to happen.
Ms. Eisenhower, do you have an additional comment on how did the United States still manage to benefit from the Russian technologies even though we beat them to the moon? As a matter of fact, they had a big rocket and it blew up on the pad, and it was their moon rocket.
Are you talking about the period after we
Back
started
then.
cooperation? Yes.
Right.
Well,
With the Soviet Union.
first of all, some of this is outlined in my book, but I think we learned, for instance, a number of things, the Russians, for instance, and actually probably Bill ought to be answering this question in large measure, but we learned a lot about how a completely different group of people would launch rockets. They were organizing their rocket launches using, having their rockets horizontally maintained and then hoisting them up and launching them. I think we learned a lot about redundancy. Help me here, Bill. It's been a long time since I wrote that book, but we use numerical redundancy. They use functional redundancy. Would you like to maybe, could I cede my?
Absolutely.
I'd just say again, we learned an awful lot, and both Jeff and Leroy can also add their own experience. When you solve the same physical problems and you see another country, another group of engineers solve that same physical problem, and because you've been isolated, you see their solution to that problem in a very different light, and that gives you a tremendous exposure, and that's one of the true advantages of cooperation. Space Station is amazing. If you look at the heat shield or the debris shields on the outside of Space Station, there's a Russian design for, and we're all protecting ourselves from micrometeoroids, small penetrations of the pressure shell. You can see how the Russians solved the problem. You can see how the Italians solved the problem. You can see how the Europeans solved the problem, how the Japanese solved the problems, and how the U.S. solves the problems. And every one of them does exactly the same job, but they do it in a very different manner fundamentally. So you gain a tremendous experience and a new way of thinking that really helps you become innovative and creative as you try to build your next program.
Yeah, I would totally agree with all of those comments. During my experience with the Russians, as I mentioned earlier, my going-in position was, why are we doing this? Our stuff's so much better. What do we have to learn from them? But the fact is, as Mr. Gerstenmaier just said, the fact is that when you see perspectives, different cultures, different entities solve the same technical problems from a different approach, it really broadens your own perspective. And personally, having done spacewalks using both American spacesuits and Russian spacesuits, I really came to admire certain elements of their design, the approach, and it's really been eye-opening, and that's just one example.
So did Sandra Bullock in Gravity. Another example, I think, is the Russian engine, RD-180. It creates temperatures and pressure because of some alloys that they are very, very good at. That it's an extraordinary engine. Yeah. And we have the license to it, but we don't know all the techniques of how they blend all those metals to be able to have that kind of thrust in an engine. Mr. Manber, tell me about why do you think that we are nearing a point where commercial exploration could become viable?
Because I have a lot of customers.
And why is that we're nearing
Well,
that point?
apologies, Mr. Senator. I think the primary reason is the stability we enjoy in policy in low Earth orbit. We have actually reached a moment in the midst of all the politics we have in Washington where this Congress has given us in the space community at least a 10-year horizon. And that is extraordinary. And we were about to lose a significant foreign customer, in fact, to the Chinese. And the reason was they were looking at a long-term project on board Space Station. And we were planning to bring down Station 2020. And the Chinese are out there commercially marketing their space station now. And when the announcement was made that we're extending it at least to 2024, they came back. And so I think the answer to the question, and I think it's a lesson for us as we look at beyond low Earth orbit, is we have a stable policy now. We have robust transportation to and from the station, or at least two. We have a bipartisan agreement that the station should be continued. We have NASA not competing with the private sector. And we have a very good regulatory framework, the IGA, the Intergovernmental Agreement, which lays out the rules of the road. In that environment, I'm willing, my investors are willing to make investments, and customers are willing to make plans. So the answer to the question is we have a stable policy and existing hardware in space.
And do you have any suggestions what NASA could learn from the commercial partners?
Oh, do I see? Yeah, what government does best, as Mr. Gerstenmaier has said in these hearings so many times, what government does best, what NASA does best, is plan and develop. Government does not do operations that well in any industry. They don't run our airlines. They don't do our cars. You don't rent a car from a government agency. And so I think what NASA can learn from the experience we're having together on space stations to relax a little bit. If they can provide with congressional funding the infrastructure, let the commercial sector add on. We have a small satellite program now on Space Station. We just deployed 33 small satellites from the station with no additional taxpayer funding. We took the risk. We invested the money. We built the hardware. We got it through the NASA safety process and the Japanese Space Agency safety process, and it's all working fine. And I think what we're learning is NASA should not be trying to do the bells and whistles. Provide the opportunity, provide the infrastructure, if that's, the basic facilities, and then let the commercial sector invest its own funds. We still don't have a NASA contract. Unfortunately. But no, we still don't have a NASA contract. And we're very happy with that because they don't design our hardware, and we take the risk. And so I think the lesson for both sides to learn is let the commercial sector do what we do best in any market, including space.
What can the commercial efforts do to generate more excitement among young people until we can actually get American bodies in American rockets flying back?
When we started NanoRacks, we did not start it to do education. I'm not a teacher. I didn't think of education. Today, we have an unbelievable program at NanoRacks where through our educational partners, we've flown over 45 or 50 school districts in America. We're flying Florida high schools, universities. There's a program in California with Valley Christian, which is now 14 Christian high schools. It's even gone international. We fly Israeli high schools, all with no NASA funding. It's not a NASA program. NASA's the landlord, NASA's the safety, NASA and the taxpayers have given us this opportunity. And I will say that NanoRacks is a small company. We're not in space news and those things that often. But we're in the, Albany this and all these small town newspapers where we're giving these kids the opportunities. We have parents doing bake sales to fly on the space station. And we have some students now that have gone from high school to Stanford and other national universities, and both at the high school level and in university, they're doing projects on space station through us. And so I guess the answer to your question is we move so quickly. We're able to do these student projects in one school year. And it takes NASA, unfortunately, far longer to get through the process and the payload integration for whatever reason. And so I think the answer is just with us willing to invest our own hardware, education, partner with educational schools. We're partnering with CASIS now, the non-governmental organization, to do even more schools. And I think at times people get bothered when you put the word commercial and education in the same sentence. But I think what we're seeing is we move so quickly, we invest our facilities. The teachers say the kids never forget that opportunity. So the more that we're not an educational company. The more folks who come to us to do it, the more schools, high schools, homeschooling, we're even reaching out to now, the better it is. And I think there's a lot of excitement under the surface. What Senator Rubio was talking about, I think under the surface there's a lot of excitement on station. We shouldn't forget about space station.
You dealt in commercialization with the Russian station Mir, is that correct?
Yes, it is. I admit it.
From that experience and your ISS experience, what would you anticipate would be your challenges on a Chinese station?
Do you mean commercially or
commercially?
Well, the Chinese are now competing against us now, and I'm trying to match already what I know their prices to be. First, what I learned from the experience with Mir is you can market a space station. That was where we learned you can. Second, you can work with a government agency, even if in this case it was Russian, different government. I think what we'll learn is that from all indications we're seeing at NanoRacks is that the Chinese will pursue a commercial pathway. They're offering already opportunities with other sovereign nations in exchange for minerals or exchange for other opportunities. And so I think what I'm taking away from the experience on Mir and ISS is that the Chinese will be a formidable commercial competitor. I want to win in the marketplace, not because they're Chinese, but because they're a competitor to us. We can work with them. But I think that the lesson we have got to be clear on in this country is that space stations are commercial platforms. They have political purposes as well. They're important. They're going to be more important, and we need one. And I did fight in the 90s to bring to ensure that the Mir did not come down, and I lost that battle. But now I'm fighting to make sure the ISS doesn't come down. And for many of the same reasons, it's extraordinarily critical that we keep the ISS going as long as it's technically feasible, because it has political implications and it has commercial implications as well for us.
We're going to try to do that in a NASA authorization bill if we can ever get over the problems of sequester.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Any final comments from anybody on the panel? Thank you. It's been most illuminating. Thank you for your expertise and your testimony, and thank you for your devotion to our space program. The meeting is adjourned.